Yeah, I started that. Okay. I've been kicking around New York government and politics for a fairly long time. And I have over time came to some conclusions that a lot of our discourse, our political discourse in New York is wrong. And that's kind of why I started this. I'm hoping to change a little bit the political conversation in New York. My take on some of the earlier comments, and then generally my take on sort of New York ideology is probably a little oblique. It's not per se left or right. What I contend is that regulation is a huge deal, and it's not measured in any effective way, and that America has fundamentally changed in the last 40, 50 years. We've become a regulatory state in many respects. It explains a lot of our politics, it explains a lot of economics. I think New York got a bad dose of it, and it has an impact. And the cost of living is a somewhat contentious issue. Can you really measure it? And some people say you can't very well, and I'm open to that. So maybe I should start by sort of defending myself. The question is, am I right? Because what I'm going to argue is that New York has an extremely high cost of living, and therefore, in purchasing power parity terms, we're in fact poor, and perhaps astoundingly poor. And that probably explains the astounding out-migration from New York. That has had, as a state, the worst population performance of any state in America since 1970. If you take into account the demographic churn, i.e. the huge increase in immigration from foreign lands. When I did the numbers, we were dead last. If you do that, if you're not, we were 47 last. We had about 18 million people in New York in 1970. It's 19 and change today. If our population had grown at the same rate as the rest of the country, if the children of the baby boomers had stayed, we'd have something like 25 million people in New York. We don't. That means roughly 1 out of 4 people. I couldn't find any kind of similar out-migration looking around the world other than the out-migration that occurred from between 1949 and 1961 from East Germany to West Germany, which is faster. So they built the Berlin Wall. So my contention is the taxes, which is a lot of what I call the political discourse. People talk about taxes, and taxes are too high in New York. But the disparity in cost of living is dramatically higher. So, to me, cost of living estimates are an indirect way of trying to capture in an aggregate form these overall costs of regulation. The NYCRR, as I understand, is like 45,000 pages in New York. And these things add up in terms of cost. Now, on the homepage, if you didn't, it's going to be hard for you to follow if you didn't do my handout, but I said, what I argue is that internationally, people talking to us, this is gaining attention. We've created a regulatory state. So the World Bank now has a system. They use a lot of volunteer work from prominent law firms to try to measure the cost of regulation in various global cities and rank that. The OECD has been talking about trying to measure the cost of regulation. They promote on something that I put on my homepage called the International Standard Cost Manual, which was recently put together, I think, in Holland. And it's really a fairly simple heuristic, which sort of walks people through when they want to introduce a new regulation. They say, well, how many hours do you have to spend filling out the paperwork? And you do other kind of estimates or other measurements, and you add it all up. What's the scope of this industry that you be regulated? So we're trying to put price tags on these regulations. So I put on what gets measured gets done. The standard view in government, you can't solve a problem until you can measure it. I think CompStat. I quote something, regulatory policy from the OECD. Regulatory policy must focus on 2 dimensions of regulatory activity. The appraisal of new regulation to ensure the quality of the flow of new regulations and the reform of existing old regulations thus stop. We don't do this very well in New York. I was working in the past for the Department of State one time, and I was interested in a cost-benefit analysis for something that we were supposed to regulate. And I said, let's find somebody who does this on a regular basis. So we called around to every state agency, and there was not a single one economist anywhere in New York who's doing cost and benefit analysis, not even at DEC. Now, in my presentation, there's an article I published in the City Journalist. I used different sources. And a lot of people question them, fair enough. One of the more recent ones comes out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis by an international expert on this, who, and her desire and intent is to get Congress to give her money to perform a really good survey to measure these things. But in the meantime, she's manipulated CPI data as best she can to do it. And she says that the New York State cost of living, its most recent edition, is 31.8% above the national average. California is very high. If you use her data and then you deflate, I use median household income. Mayor Bloomberg likes to say that it's like 5,000 people to pay all the taxes, which is what Jim Parrott was talking about, and of course is correct. I'll get to that in the end. So median household income is a better sort of measurement. And if you use her data for New York State, and she does two versions of it. The first time out, she did a straight deflation, or she deflated it by the full amount. Second time out, she took out some of the elements, and I asked her why, and I couldn't understand the answer. I think part of it is she thought it was a good idea, and part of it is it's politically charged. If you start to use government transfer, you start to deflate government transfer payments because people start fighting over these things. Anyway, but that's standard. New York is the second poorest state in the country. If you use the full number, it's the poorest state. Mississippi would be 49th or 50th. You have to believe her. So maybe you don't. But if it's not totally true, and it's only partially true, it's a big deal. I say in a little introductory statement I have on my homepage, I say that if you could just lower the cost of living by 1% in New York, you'd be talking about $11 trillion in economic value, roughly speaking. We argue a lot over $1 billion tax increase, and so that's where we should. So this to me is real money, and I feel we don't really know, but I have to assume that a lot of this outmigration has something to do with regulation. And there are other sources. Let's see, a couple more points. Thomas Sowell wrote a recent book on the housing boom and bust. We've talked about what happened here. And he starts his whole narrative at land use in California. And said that's when the prices of housing in California got out of control, that's what impelled a lot of the banks to create these exotic mortgages. That doesn't make him right, but it's an interesting point of view, and he's a smart guy. I wrote a piece for Joel Cottman's webzine, and it had sort of a takeoff on California, and I said, well, the taxes in California aren't that different. It's only, what did I say? If Californians were tired of paying an additional 0.8% of their income in state and local taxes, what would they make of this study that the Bureau of Economic Analysis that said the cost of living was a whopping 29.1% above the national average. Now, my idea is I'm hoping to get economic people to post, those people, individuals, average business people who know what it costs, plus potentially academic stuff. I haven't had too much luck, so far it's a blog. But this did generate a thread that I found on the internet from somewhere else, and it was based on California. It was a back and forth. I'm going to read it from Texas and California. And this is a person who has the San Francisco 49ers logo on his post. Well, he's a builder, designer, used to live in California, lives in Texas. He says, I could certainly do in California what I do here, build and design. But as I stated, a lot of the market there is corporate. It's corporate for the reason that it's so expensive, laborious, and exhausting to build there, especially coastal. There are so many hurdles to jump, and the cost of doing business and buying property is so high that you have to have very deep pockets to do so, especially now that credit is so tight. From environmental impact studies, coastal commission review, high city impact and building fees, to water rationing, laborious licensing for all trades, high workers' comp, high cost of property, all of those things I just listed are very minor and don't exist in Texas. The Economist recently wrote a publication, California vs. Texas. California may back lose for the first time in its history a congressional seat. in the next census. Texas is able to accommodate this huge population. My contention is that a lot of it has to do with regulation. Texas may not be the prettiest place in the world, but you can afford a home. The Economist said in this article that you can find a decent home, 1,500 square foot in Houston for $100,000. So I think these matter. Now, a couple of sources for why I did this. One of them, I'll mention quickly. I was listening to Anthony Weiner last fall at speaking at the Citizens Union, and his whole spiel was about the middle class is leaving New York, the middle class is leaving New York. And then he said something, oh, but our income data are really high. Well, which is it? I mean, yeah, if nominal data was the only thing that matters, fine market in Germany for the rich, it's what you can buy for your hard-earned dollars or rupees or euros or whatever. That's what they do internationally. That's what the World Bank would do, whatever, purchase parity. Another source was I was working as a policy advisor for former Secretary of State who was exploring a run for governor some years ago. African American, and once wanted to run as a Republican, so I kind of had to scratch my head like that. And think of what some Venn diagrams might be where we could find a little common ground possibly. And I feel a little uncomfortable about this, but it's already been raised by Jim Carrey and others. Race. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring to people's attention, because I think it's an astounding point of view, that's missing in our political discourse, where we are still the great, progressive beacon of liberalism, and the South is benighted and backwards and so forth. Well, I mean, anyone who knows the South, who's been to the South over decades, knows there has been simply an astounding phenomenal change. And African American, the prosperity that you see visually. Yogi Berra said you can observe a lot just by watching. Among African Americans, it's a night and day from what existed 30 or 40 years ago. And so that seems to be a standard. I mean, we always like to say that we care more and we want to fight inequality. Obviously that's a major form of inequality in our history. So I tried to do some of these median household incomes by race. And what you find is there are a number of states in the South where African Americans now have a higher standard of living than they do in New York. I think that's a problem. It doesn't say a lot from us. I looked at them, just using the limited numbers from this professors at the VBA. We see that, let's see, Georgia, that's GA. They come out 38, I have it at 38,405 for median household income. New York comes in at 32,177. North Carolina comes in at 33,267. So these were places where the civil rights movement started. People couldn't get served, and it's a dramatic historical change, and not one that makes us look like we're really doing our job. So that I wanted to mention, and I think that I think that there is a so why? Well, I think that we need to do a better job. Oh, let me make one last point. As to the question of whether or not this is a valid way of looking at things, I came across something on the internet recently, a paper recently, I guess it was commissioned by the International Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. as part of the Doha round. And what they did was they used EIU, and Economist Intelligence Unit price estimates, and they used that, plus they used a complaint index, which is what my forum is, which we have our builder from Fort Worth telling us, to try to measure the impact of non-tariff trade barriers, which we can assume are something like regulation, right? They looked up the price of bovine meat, among other things. I think that's a steak, hamburger, and found tremendous disparities. So this is something that people are doing at a very high level. I think it would be a great thing if people in New York tried to apply some of the institutional human capital necessary to make that happen. But it shows you that's what popped into my head, trying to think about this issue, popped into some other people's head. How do you measure these hard to measure things, i.e. regulation? They have a huge impact on people, but we can't look them up. It used to be with tariffs, you look it up, you see what the schedule is for, propylene, glycol, whatever, and you find out what it is. You can't really look up a non-tariff trade barrier. You can't really look up how much does it cost to do an environmental impact statement or seeker and all these things. So it's a huge part of our economy. Now in this thing, well, one of the things I mentioned, I have a little piece from, this is from the Harvard, this is actually from John Lomborg, that people don't like, but anyway. Book he wrote some years ago about the environment, but he cites this Center for Risk Analysis, and they say there's tremendous disparity in the costs of regulation. One last thing in here is I talk about that you add healthcare mandates, that costs states. There's a little graph that said there's a dead weight loss every time you do that. I know you struggle with the Regina Hertz stimulator. You will appreciate that. And I think, so I don't even get to these things, but what I will, maybe I get to them. There's a quote in here from about the Federal Register. You can sort of see it. There's a huge increase in regulations over the years, huge increase in lobbying. This is what's driving modern American politics, what's driving our economy. There was a big decrease in regulations during the Reagan year, and you may have noticed that the recession was very limited. Wall Street basically remade America in the early 80s. We missed that 82 recession in New York City largely because of the deregulation that occurred under Carter and then under Reagan. So it matters. It has a very positive impact. What I was trying to say here is I think we need to focus more on what should government do and what should it not do. I have a little thing in here I was going to talk about.
Let me just go back to a point you made a couple minutes ago, even if I may be wrapping up. Your suggestion that economists should start paying more attention to this issue, and no better way to close a conference than by assigning additional research. So
additional research.
I appreciate that very much.
I'm going to argue that we are still sort of we talked today about education. People talk about the cost of housing. That if you look at this other chart, it shows you that housing is a pure private good. Shows you that higher education is a largely private good. Healthcare is a significantly private good. I think New York, we're still living in the shadow of Richard Musgrave, the first person to start talking about what government should and shouldn't do. He talks about Merritt Watts. Paul Samuelson comes along a little bit later, gets a little clearer. It's a lot clearer today. We need to understand what government should do and not do, and we should understand that regulation has cost, and we should do a much better job of measuring those because it has a huge impact. And the final thing I wanted to say is, if you've been reading the Financial Times, and there's 4 articles in there, they've been running about a month of campaign against finance. I know they're kind of statist newspaper, but Europe is looking at the gift horse of finance in the mouth and basically saying, take it out and shoot it. That has not shown up in America. This may be a huge boon for New York, but if it's not, and finance stops generating these huge profits, which we now know in many cases to have been spurious, then we really do need to get our economic house in order.